Hello listeners, welcome back to Peking Hotel. I'm your host Leo. The key words to the success of the Chinese Communist Revolution are luck and violence. At least that's according to Professor Frank Dikötter. In this episode, we continue our two-part series on the founding and rise of the Chinese Communist Party today, from where we left off in our last conversation with Professor Frank Dikötter, a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and chair professor of humanities at the University of Hong Kong. Based on his new book, Red Dawn over China, we trace the origin of the Chinese communists to the French Revolution and reached 1929 when the Soviet Union launched a now forgotten invasion into Manchuria. And today we explore the rest of the story from 1929 through the Long March, the Yan'an period during the Sino-Japanese War, and ultimately the communists winning the Civil War and founding the People's Republic. And in that process, how the Soviets aided the communists, the Japanese weakened their arch enemy, the Nationalist Party, and Edgar Snow, of all people, an American journalist that put Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party on the map. And with that, enjoy our show today. I think it's very interesting to look at this history from the Soviet point of view, because by this point, the Chinese Communist Party basically doesn't exist. It doesn't really matter. It is a small group of perhaps like-minded, perhaps not so like-minded, and individuals with questionable loyalties to the Marxist teaching, and at any rate are not really growing very fast, and with tiny membership compared to the rest of China.
Yes.
And then Chiang Kai-shek and the Soviets basically split, and Stalin realized we need our own forces and our own troops and our own men on the ground. And so the Soviet strategy in China changed, and so we began to see a different landscape emerging. And I mean, even with the Long March, it's hard to say whether the communists really had that much power. I mean, they were basically being driven out of their own Soviets and occupation zones all over China, and had to take cover on the far northwest of nowhere. And so, talk about the rise of Mao and how Communist Party grew from obscurity, really, into a force to be reckoned with.
Yes. So the book is not really all about Mao. I mean, the problem is that so much is centered on Mao when he was, for quite a long time, a pretty minor figure. But he does emerge. As I said, he's recognized by Moscow around about 1929. He's well known, of course, but he's seen as the one who might actually create that spark that ignites the prairie in 1929. More funds are sent. But to me, the entire period from 1929 up to the Long March has a number of very interesting aspects which are somehow related to Mao, but not necessarily entirely about him. So one point is that any informed listener might argue that if the communists really were such a minor party, why did the central government, which from 1928 onwards is of course the nationalists, they represent China, why did they spend so much time trying to surround the communists and eliminate them? The 5 campaigns to get rid of the communists after they established a Soviet in Jiangxi province in 1931. And this will collapse around about 1934. So why send so many troops, and why is it so difficult for Chiang Kai-shek to do this if they merely are a small bunch of bandits, really? So the answer is that all along, in fact, very specifically in 1928, the second part of the Northern Expedition. So by 27, Chiang Kai-shek has reunited the south of China, established his capital in Nanjing, and then 1928 he moves up to seize Beijing and unify the entire country. Now the point is that on his way up to Beijing, he is attacked, his troops are attacked brutally by Japanese in Jinan, Shandong province. And if you read his diary, it's very clear that this is the moment where Chiang Kai-shek realizes that the key challenge to the Republic of China is Japan. And he writes down his resolve to come up with a long-term plan. He says this needs careful planning and it needs a lot of resources to be able to repulse the Japanese. Now, the question here is, how can he do that? He cannot openly train the nationalist army to fight the Japanese. He has to keep a low profile. So the best way to maintain a large army and to train them to fight is to go and fight the communists.
Oh, interesting.
So that's point one, is that he can train his, as long as he's fighting the communists, the Japanese are quite happy. They're worried about Moscow and the communists. So as long as Chiang Kai-shek is fighting them, that's fine. So there are two stages. One is the encirclement of the Jiangxi Soviet, and then is the Long March. And I'll come back in any event to the Soviets, because there's something to be said about what happens in not just the Jiangxi Soviet, but in other Soviets. Because in fact they collapsed on their own, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So the second phase is the so-called Long March. You might argue yet again that some, 80,000 troops departed from the Jiangxi Soviet. 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 arrive a year later, October 35. You could say, well, that's a great defeat. Or you might say, well, Mao was very clever in that the nationalists never truly managed to crush him and his troops. They didn't manage to crush him in Guizhou, not in Yunnan, not in Sichuan, not in Gansu. They made their way all the way up to Shanxi, right? Now, if you read Chiang Kai-shek carefully, it becomes very clear that he uses the communists to unite the south of China. He says, it's very clear, the communists depart from the Jiangxi Soviet. And then Chiang Kai-shek says, why crush them? Why not just steer them into the provinces which are reluctant to be integrated into a unified government directed by us from Nanjing? Why not let them enter Guizhou and then we follow them and we impose our own government? Why not let them go? Yunnan is fine. Why not let them go to Sichuan and then we can impose our government? It's exactly what he does. It's exactly what he does. Merely months after the communists enter Guizhou, Chiang Kai-shek eliminates the man in charge of that province and puts his own man in control. He more or less unifies Sichuan round about that same period. So then there's another point, is that he doesn't want to pursue the communists on their long march. He says, why send armed soldiers to run across the extraordinarily inhospitable terrain of Guizhou and Yunnan and Sichuan in pursuit of people who are very lightly equipped? It's just foolish. So he says what we should do, he doesn't use the term guerrilla warfare, but this is in effect what he does. He says we will block off their access to resources. We will steer them into inhospitable terrain. We will watch them as they die of hunger and disease. And that is precisely what happens. That is precisely what happens. So time and again, troops appear to block access to resources, sending the communist troops, left, right, center, north. So that strategy works quite well. So then we go to 1936, and we should talk about that maybe separately. What happens is very, very interesting. when the communists, the rate of attrition has been so horrendous that there's hardly any left. And Chiang Kai-shek is about to crush them. And then, of course, the CN incident. We can talk about that in a minute. But the other aspect I want to talk about is the Soviets that they were able to establish in Jiangxi and other parts of southern China up till 1934, 1935. With the Long March. In fact, there are at least two Long Marches, as you know. There's not just one, there's two. They almost follow the exact same route. So what happens is that the communists seize terrain, which is very often inhospitable, and they start land reform.
Yeah.
Now, what is land reform? The idea is that you take, because the entire secondary literature is all about land reform. Now, this might work after 1945 in Manchuria. We'll talk about that later. But when it comes to the entire 1930s, there really is no such thing as land reform for the very simple reason that these Soviets are established in mountainous, inhospitable areas where the villages already struggle to survive. Then the communists arrive, impose their own alternative state, and of course require ever greater amounts of grain to feed the army and man to serve as cannon fodder. In other words, local populations are barely able to feed themselves, never mind, hand over a portion of their harvest to the communists. So the idea that you can take land from a land reformer, from a land lord and give it to the poor, doesn't make sense. There are no landlords over there. There are no rich people. So the Marxist classification is landlord, rich peasant, middle peasant, poor peasant. In reality, most of them are maybe middle, possibly poor. So before you know it, since there are no landlords, there's an attack and dispossession of the assets of rich peasants. And before you know it, there's an attempt to dispossess and accuse so-called middle peasants of being rich peasants. So people are not stupid. Villagers realize that the more they have, the greater the risk of dispossession. So they start producing less and less. They realize that to produce anything more than they need to feed themselves is counterproductive because it will be confiscated, seized by the communists. So there's a very interesting document where it says, the communists, this is not the Jiangxi Soviet, it's another one. So the people, the villagers have become lazy. They no longer work. And why would they? Why would they? So the point really is that in a great many of the Soviets, including the Jiangxi one, it is not so much the military encirclement by the central government that leads them to collapse. It is basically villagers fleeing to other regions. And there's the fact that they begin to starve, the starvation sets in. So there's just the abandonment of the local villages and large starvation and economic collapse that forces the communists to abandon the region they had and seek greener pastures elsewhere. Zheng Guotao says it very nicely. He says, we squeeze them like a lemon. And that's what communists do. In those years, they squeeze them like a lemon. So there's no such thing as land reform. There's merely the exploitation of the local population, which forces the local population to flee.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's quite an irony that when Marx talks about capitalism would collapse under the weight of its own contradiction, what we're seeing is communism collapsing under the weight of its own economic contradictions. And the same pattern basically repeated much later that caused the Great Famine and the many other economic disasters.
Well, anyone with half a brain and aware of the famine, Mao's Great Famine, 58-62, tens of millions of people neglected, worked, starved, occasionally beaten to death. Anyone aware of the fact that the communists were not able to run their economy after 49 must wonder whether they were able to run an economy before 1949. And the point I'm trying to make is that, no, they were not able to run even a small agricultural economy. They were not able to run, in the proverbial American phrase, a lemonade stand.
Mm. And so how did they run their economy then? I mean, they must have had some sources of revenue, especially once they were settled in Yan'an and in northwestern China. They must have something to sustain themselves. I mean, you can't just be pillaging villages and raiding and then packing and go, right?
Well, it is. It is pillaging from roughly the end of 1927 up till roughly 31 is the period where they don't really have a Soviet, a base area. So those years is really just like the Taiping, just like bandits. You assault a county town, you pillage it, you kill the local magistrate and other political notables. You may hold ransom some of the wealthy families, and you burn the government offices, and you move on. So that's exactly what they do. It's very precisely what they pillage and rampage and use ransoms, increasingly of foreigners. That's up to 31. Then they managed to get hold of inhospitable terrain far away from the center of power, that they basically exploit the local population until the economy collapses through the sheer weight of that impoverishment. And then from 36 onwards, and we'll have to talk about that, of course, is the United Front. So all along, they also get support from the Soviet Union. But in particular, after 1937, they get funding from the Soviet Union, but 70 to 90% of the funding actually comes from Nanjing, the central government. So Nanjing actually pays within the framework of the United Front established around about 36, 37. It becomes
that's to fight the Japanese, right? After the Xi'an incident.
Yeah, so we'll come back to that in 1 second. Why do they want to fight the Japanese? Very interesting point. It won't be long, don't worry. But from 37 onwards, in fact, the central government agrees to fund the communists. So they stopped funding them around about 1940-41. So several things happened. First, the communists from 37 onwards do nothing but fight the central troops under the central government, not the Japanese. So the central government, the nationals, are quite upset about that and stop funding roundabout when the Germans invade the Soviet Union. Because they think, well, if the Soviet Union can no longer dictate that we should fund the communists, we can stop. And of course, Moscow stops itself because it now has to fight the great might of the Third German Empire. I mean, the Nazis, right? 3 million man in 3 columns smash across the border on the 21st of June 1941. So around about 41, that funding stops. So here there is some remarkable work done by Chen Yongfa. I haven't discovered much that is new, that shows how very quickly in Yan'an, which has become the wartime capital of the communists up in Shanxi, that the economy collapses. They try to have people work around the clock. They try to trade. They try this, they try that. All of it fails quite miserably until they start producing opium. And thanks to opium, they managed to financially get through to 1945. That's the story. That's the story of that's the economic story of the Chinese Communist Party up till 1945.
Yes, of course. Opium is a big story. I mean, even now, a huge amount of government revenue comes from the monopoly of tobacco trade, and so the revenue from the drug trade runs quite deep in China. But so going back to the 30s and the early 40s, it seems to me that that was also the moment when Mao came of age. And I mean, he staged a series of purges. that were what he called first the anti-Bolshevik elements were purged, and then the rectification campaign. I mean, ostensibly it's against basically the KMT members that were less set on the communist ideology, but it also partly purging the Soviet elements that were sent from Moscow. And so by this point, I mean, Mao basically became a rogue figure that Moscow couldn't really control anymore.
Yes and no. So yes and no. So there are several points to be made. One is that as Mao's troops arrived at the end of the Long March, 1935 for the so-called First Long March, 1936 for the second one, they all converge upon Shanxi, 1936. As I said, their star is at their lowest. They have some 40,000 followers in a country of 500 million. What are they to do? So the solution is offered yet again by Stalin. So it is Stalin, it is Lenin who enabled the creation of the Chinese Communist Party. It is Lenin who enabled them to join the Nationalist Party and spread the faith through the Northern Expedition. It is Stalin who sustains them all the way through. It is Stalin who tells them to establish Soviets. And then it is Stalin who in 1935/36 comes up with the idea of a united front. He says something that should be crystal clear to anyone in the Republic of China. He says, you should unite with the central government and fight the Japanese, because the Japanese are the real enemy. And of course, the Japanese in 1931 have taken all of Manchuria, have a very powerful army, and they are the key threat. So Stalin says you should have a united front with the nationalists, Chiang Kai-shek. Now, of course, Stalin wants united fronts around the world, to fight what he sees as the main threat, which is, fascism. But the point really is that it takes about half a year for that message to eventually be taken on board by Mao. That's how slow he is. So he's got, the communists at this point have zero appeal, right? The workers don't really care. There have been a number of reforms to labor. Unions are encouraged by the central government. The Nationalist Party has a greater proportion of workers inside its ranks than the communists. So the workers have zero appeal. The villagers know of all the depredations and are not really keen on the communists. So the only appeal they have is with scholars, intellectuals, but they are concerned about Japan. Whereas the communists go on and on about fighting imperialism, and all they ever do to fight imperialism is burn down missionary hospitals and schools. So it's not a great amount of popular appeal there. So the intellectuals are concerned about Japan. And at that point, after about 6 months, very slowly, the penny drops and Mao thinks, yes, let's have a united front. So this idea comes from Stalin yet again.
I can see why Mao would drag his feet, right? Here I am, finally settled in northwestern China. No one is at my tail anymore. But I only have a tiny troop of, 20,000, 30,000, whatever.
Yeah.
And I hardly have an economic base, hardly really popular. And now suddenly Stalin came along and said, here's a brilliant idea for you. Why don't you become the cannon fodder of KMT so that you join their fights with the Japanese, an even more powerful enemy than the KMT. So if I were Muslim, I would think, what, are you crazy?
Well, not really, because of course what Mao does and could have done a lot earlier is first he realizes the anti-Japan message is very popular. Right. So it enhances the appeal of, it's the one thing that rescues communism from utter oblivion.
It's nationalism.
Nationalism, of course. And then something else, of course Mao is not keen to fight. And he says very clearly, we have joined the central government, the nationalists, in a united front, but we are not going to fight them. We're not going to fight them. And he doesn't fight them. There's one brief clash under Lin Biao
Yeah.
And that's about it. Strategically entirely unimportant. So that's important. But then the next one I think is even more interesting. In 1939, I believe, a Soviet leader from Siberia, I forgot his name. I think his name was Genrikh Lyushkov. So you would have to check the facts. But basically goes to Tokyo and becomes a traitor. So Stalin really wants to purge all of Siberia because, of course, he can see a war coming up. All of Manchuria is now in the hands of Japan. So Japan is
Buffer's almost gone.
Right on the border. So he wishes to purge, really thoroughly purge the Communist Party and the military in Siberia. And then what happens, of course, is that the Japanese think there is a great opportunity. Stalin has purged the army in Siberia, so they want to attack the Soviet troops, which they do in August 1939 in the Battle of Nomonhan, which is hardly ever mentioned by anyone, even if a great historian called Alvin Cooks, I believe, Coox, published 2 volumes on it decades ago. But the point really is that the Soviets crushed the Japanese with their tanks. It's a brutal encounter, of steel, which convinces the Japanese military that they do not ever want to fight the Soviets again. So the 2 points, one is that the Japanese decide to not fight the Soviets, and they want to go and get their oil, instead of getting it from Siberia, they want to go all the way down and get it from the Dutch Indies, Indonesia and elsewhere, which means that they must control the Pacific Ocean, which means that they must attack Pearl Harbor. So that particular battle between Russia and the Soviet Union in the summer of 1939 has huge implications for the Second World War. And weeks later, as a peace agreement is signed between Moscow and Tokyo, Stalin has that front, has one side, has the east under control. Then, of course, he attacks with Germany Poland and divides it straight in the middle. But the key point I'm also trying to make is that throughout all these purges, Stalin actually writes to Mao. And this is not a letter I discovered. It's Alexander Pantsov, in his biography of Chiang Kai-shek, who discovered a letter in the Soviet archives. So I've used a lot of Soviet archive, but the one published in the 7 volumes of the Comintern literature, extremely important. But he came up with a letter where very clearly Moscow says that Mao should not trust the people generally described as the 28 Bolsheviks. In other words, the people who were sent by Pavel Mif and other Soviets to China. He says these people are all traitors. You shouldn't trust them. You should trust Liu Shaoqi. You should trust Lin Biao. You should trust Zhu De. So what I'm trying to say here is that the leadership that emerges through the purges carried out in Yan'an was actually the leadership that Stalin had highlighted in his letter. It is Stalin who said, don't trust any of those Bolsheviks. Now, that's the key point. Now, it goes further. We could talk about Yan'an, but as you know, most of your listeners, if they've gotten this far, they probably know enough about Chinese, are interested enough in Chinese history to realize that there were purges carried out in Yan'an from roughly 41-42 up till roughly 43-44. But the key point really is that Mao is often said, besides purging the party and coming up with his own team and getting rid of all the Bolsheviks, so that question I've answered, this is Stalin who initiates it, it is often thought that the great contribution of Mao was that he really sinified Marxism in Yan'an. He's the one who came up and said, look, we have our own conditions. This is China. We're not at all like the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, that misses out a crucial part of the story. You Remember that we talked about the Comintern repeatedly, established in 1919 to overthrow capitalist governments. Stalin in 1943 abolishes the Comintern. Now you might think, why would he want to do that? The Comintern is the instrument to really try to promote a world revolution across the borders. So why would he want to abolish that? Because there has been a turning point in the Second World War with Stalingrad. So for the first time, Stalin and the rest of the world can see how the end of the the Second World War is coming near, how the Nazis are being driven back. So Stalin is thinking ahead. He realizes that if his troops go all the way to Berlin, they might as well stay in some of those countries, including, of course, Poland, which he had invaded with Hitler in any event back in September 1939. So he abolishes the Comintern and then says no communist party should follow the model established by the Soviet Union. Each party should respond to its own history, its own culture, its own social conditions, its own political circumstances. In other words, he's trying to say each communist party, in Yugoslavia, in Poland, China, they should all adapt to local circumstances. So why does he say it? Because he doesn't want the communist parties in Eastern Europe to look like mere puppets controlled by Moscow. He wants them to look genuine, indigenous, coming from the bottom up, not engineered by Moscow. So Mao doesn't waste any time. The moment he realizes that this is the new message from Moscow, he does exactly what Stalin told foreign communist parties to do. He indigenizes it. He starts saying exactly what Stalin told him to say. The Chinese Communist Party is unique. It has very different social conditions. He simplifies it.
I mean, of course, that is still part of their speech.
It is still part of the speech. So I'm afraid that in many cases, the United Front, the fight against Japan, the initiator is Stalin. The formation of a new leadership in Yan'an is very much initiated by Stalin. The whole idea of the sinification of Marxism in China is also initiated by Stalin in 1943. So Stalin is time and again the great architect of all of this.
And for all that the Soviets have done, I think you make a rather daring claim that it is Edgar Snow that put Mao on the map.
Yes, absolutely.
And at this point, it's the Americans who are coming in to basically help the communists.
Yes.
Could you talk a bit about that story?
Yes, absolutely. So Edgar Snow, fascinating man. It took me a while to realize that his daughter, that he lived a mere 3 streets away from where I lived in Switzerland as an undergraduate student. I may have passed in front of his house on my bicycle.
In Geneva?
In Lyon, which is along the lake of Geneva. And his daughter went to the same university in Geneva in the same faculty of arts. I was studying Russian and Chinese. She was studying Spanish, I believe. So we were not that far away. But the point really is that Edgar Snow, journalist from Missouri, is invited to interview the communists, Mao in particular, in Bao'an. It's not Yan'an quite yet, in 1936. And of course, first publishes a number of articles, which then turned into a book called Red Star Over China. And that has enormous appeal, really places Mao and the communists on the map, and is I think, pretty much the origin of this founding myth, the communists being, the ones who are in tune with the modern spirit of the 20th century and fighting the good fight against imperialism, fascism, peasant immiseration, and feudalism. They're the ones who really will be about to fight Japan as well and liberate hundreds of millions. So that story really dates from that book, Red Star Over China. But what is so interesting, to come to the second part of your question, is that indeed the Americans, as they move back through the Pacific, approaching Japan, these are just horrific fights at the Pearl Harbor with huge casualties. So they're very keen on the support of Stalin and agree that Stalin will, invade in 1945 Manchuria. But they're also keen on getting the support of anyone in China, including the communists. So from 1942, 1943 onwards, time and again, they urge the Republic of China, one of the four Allied powers, a government that went with the Americans into Burma. They urged them to come up with a agreement with the communists. And not only that, but one journalist after the other, American, portrays the communists as mere agrarian reformers, as a sort of democrats, not true communists. Now, you might ask yourself, could this be Stalin again? And my answer is, yes, it is Stalin again. Yes, in 1943, Stalin tells the American ambassador in Moscow, I forgot his name, tells him, these communists in China, they're not real communists. They're margarine communists. That's what he tells them. And of course, the Soviets tell this to any American who's willing to listen. So it reinforces the idea, if Stalin himself doesn't recognize the Chinese communists and portrays them as, mere fake communists, how could he be wrong? So the Americans, not just the journalists, but the State Department, the vice president is so keen that they believe in this and see the communists as mere democrats, whereas Chiang Kai-shek is seen as a sort of fascist. So this is the situation. Everyone can describe, write, criticize so-called Free China, but nobody can travel to Yan'an, which is a forbidden zone. Yet Yan'an is portrayed as a sort of realm of freedom and democracy, whereas Chongqing is portrayed as an authoritarian fascist regime. Now, there are no quiet boys, we all know that, but what is the evidence? So after the purges in Yan'an, from roughly 42, 43 to 44, Mao has clean shop, and he starts inviting a limited number of journalists and government representatives from the United States to Yan'an. And it is, of course, a showcase, right? It's a Potemkin village. These journalists visit model schools, model farms, encounter actors. The whole thing is scripted from beginning to end. Some of the archives describe how these propaganda teams are keen on making sure that villagers who work along the road, which is used by these foreign journalists, the villagers should actually look up and wave at the foreigners. Everything is scripted. It's quite extraordinary. So there's this image of democracy which is being proposed by Mao, a facade of democracy, even if behind that facade, for the best part of 3 years, tens of thousands of people have been interrogated, tortured, purged, occasionally executed. That's the contrast. It's quite a story, really.
I mean, obviously, the playbook repeated itself again when ping-pong diplomacy happened and when Nixon visited China and when rounds of foreign journalists and students and tourists were invited to visit Daqing and Dazhai in the 70s and came back rather starry-eyed looking at Communist China.
Absolutely. There's no end of foreigners who come back starry-eyed. It doesn't really matter what the Communist Party does. It can starve tens of millions. And you will have Canadians.
Unbelievable.
The papa of Justin Trudeau comes back and says there is no famine and this is a model to be followed. François Mitterrand, future president of France, also goes to China, interviews Mao and reassures the world on his return from China in the midst of the famine, that nothing is wrong with the People's Republic of China. These are all rulers. There's this endless number of starry-eyed people. So the key, what is the key? That's a really good question. And why? Why not with the Soviet Union? But, well, first answer is there are fellow travelers of the Soviet Union. There are entire working-class families who moved from the United States to the Soviet Union after the collapse of the economy in 1929, the Wall Street crash. But the point I'm trying to make is that all along, the mistake made by the Americans and others during the Second World War is repeated time and again. And that mistake is to deny, to not believe that Chinese communism is real communism. To believe that Chinese communism is really something else. So since you mentioned ping-pong diplomacy, Kissinger believes that China is not communist. He writes about it being a Confucian, it has a Confucian past, it's a Confucian entity. Bush Senior and Junior later on, after the massacre in Beijing and elsewhere in 1989, is convinced that somehow Deng Xiaoping is a true reformer at heart. Like Clinton talks about China becoming a true responsible stakeholder, believing, like so many others, that with economic reform, China will emerge as a democrat. There will be political reform. So they're all thinking that these communists will somehow shed their skin and come out as full-fledged Democrats. We're just waiting.
But it's not just China that's being exceptionalizing and say, oh, actually, they're not that bad. They're not really communists. They're something else. There are also American journalists and I believe diplomats who are visiting Russia, Soviet Union in the 30s, passing through gulags of all places and still singing the praises of the great Soviet experiments. And so I think there's something deeper about communism and communist ideals getting hold of people's imagination, and the fact that for all the capitalist appeals and the capitalist leanings and preferences of the American people, somehow they're not really immune from the communist ideology.
Yes, I think the book that one should refer to at this stage is really Paul Hollander, that remarkable historian, political scientist, in a good way. That book called Political Pilgrims. It's a beautifully written book, and he looks at how so many foreigners from so many walks of life visit these countries, communist countries, or other dictatorships, and come back starry-eyed. Now, Bernard Shaw visited the playwright, the playwright, who should know about how you put up a play, visits Moscow in the 1930s, visits, of course, model prisons, model schools, model farms, believes all of it, dies with the portrait of Stalin by his bedside. That's Bernard Shaw, and there are countless other examples.
Yeah, it's too many.
Yes, but in the case of China, there really is something quite different, I think. In that there's deep hatred of the Soviet Union among those on at least the right, and occasionally also on the part of those of the left. Certainly in Europe, there's a strong tradition in Europe of an anti-Soviet tradition of the left, but not necessarily when it comes to China. It is precisely the people on the right, the anti-Soviet leaders, who become most pro-PRC by the end of the 1970s onwards in the United States of America. But this is a different debate.
Yeah. So it seems to me that just by sheer stroke of luck, that the Chinese Communist Party and Mao Zedong find themselves at the point where galactic forces were well aligned in their interest. They had the Soviets who were backing them. They had the Japanese who were crushing their enemy and really having KMT taking the brunt of that war, while the communists growing themselves from, 30,000 troops to 100,000 troops to a party membership of 800,000 by just 1941, and obviously they kept growing. And then the Americans came along and told their partners in KMT who are all American educated, who have experience with American society, education, political elites, economic elites, who spoke English, who were Christian, who fought alongside the American brothers and sisters who were fighting diligently against the Japanese and in Burma, and being a true ally in the fullest sense of the term, that actually you guys need to partner with your enemy in the Northwest who weren't doing that much other than just resting and biding their time. And so just by sheer stroke of luck, right, that Mao Zedong came to this rather strong position. I don't know if he expected it. I mean, what do you make of it? Is it just lucky, or is there something else to it?
Absolutely, it's great luck. It's absolute great luck, and a successful dictator in general is someone with great skills, and it would be foolish to not realize that Mao has a great many political skills. He knows how to manipulate people. He often knows how to read a situation. But one of the greatest skills of successful dictators is that they know how to wait, but they also know how to use fortune and misfortune. And he's very good at it. He uses it very, very well. So even by 1945, Mao is quite disappointed that the Soviet Union is not really coming to his rescue. Until, of course, 1 million soldiers cross the border into Manchuria, stay on, and then Mao doesn't even realize that he could regroup in Manchuria. But that becomes a strategy. The Soviets say you can regroup in Manchuria, provided that you call yourselves local partisans, local guerrilla fighters, not Communist Party members. This is what they do. So they all cross the border into Manchuria. The Soviets hand over the countryside to them in 1945. Then George Marshall, the Americans, lend a hand by imposing a coalition on them. And then even as once the Soviets leave, they arrive in August 45, they leave round about, I think it is May 46, much later. As they leave, the troops of the central government start moving up the railways. They attack the communists. They are about to crush them, pushing back the communists across the border into Siberia, when again George Marshall intervenes, imposes a truce, and then in September 1946 imposes an arms embargo on the central government, their partner in arms during the Second World War. So in effect, from September 46 onwards, indeed, the communists are being armed to the teeth by the Soviet Union with train load after another, coming across the border from Siberia with weapons, with arsenals established, with officers trained in Moscow, gaining advanced training, even as the central government has to first reconstruct an enormous country in rubble, just like Europe, and two, has to fight with their hands behind their back against a communist party which is armed and supported by the Soviet Union. So it becomes quite difficult.
Yeah. And even at that point, one might say that it's not clear that the communists would win. No. Yes, they were growing. Yes, they took over Manchuria thanks to the Soviets. And by the way, Soviets also took a bunch of power plants and factories. Basically, the Soviets pillaged parts of Manchuria and also raped women and conducted massacre and all that against the local Chinese. But then they... Yeah, as well as the Soviets do, apparently.
As one does as a Soviet. Yes.
But they did put the Communist Party properly on a strong footing in Manchuria, so they could attack south. But even then, it's not clear that the communists would win, and that's partly why Mao was in favor, or somewhat in favor of a coalition government. I mean, that would really put them on equal footing with the KMT. And so, At what point do you think the power balance finally flipped in the communists' favor, and it's just clear that they were winning now?
To me, the key point is that once they have the countryside in Manchuria Now we're not talking about some miserable little Soviets in Jiangxi province from 31 to 30. We're not talking about some, incredibly inhospitable terrain around Yan'an and Shanxi province.
This is the most fertile piece of imperial land for both Qing and the Japanese Empire.
Oh, yes. And in case your readers forgot, Manchuria is about the size of France and the United Kingdom combined. It's absolutely
And it's also the most
massive.
advanced industrial area.
Even after the Soviets stripped a great deal, there was enough there in natural resources and industrial base, and of course the strategic gateway. This is, after all, where the Manchus came from in 1644. Right. So the point really is that all of that makes a massive difference in that now they can, at long last, they start in 46, 47 in particular, they can at long last implement land reform. So land reform really is a way of targeting potential enemies, power holders. You are slightly wealthier than another. You have been elected as village head. We will now target you and pit the majority of the villagers against you, distribute your assets to all of them so that all of them have blood on their hands. And then we can recruit, and they recruit massively, frequently under duress. We have very detailed descriptions of this. So they can recruit a lot of man, and they can get grain from the countryside. So that's a key point. Plus weapons. The weapons deposited by the Japanese in Manchuria, handed over by the Soviet Union, but also weapons from the Soviet Union. And they contribute massively, something that you can find very clearly in the Soviet documents. The amount of aid that they receive is quite enormous. But the point really I want to make is that Mao himself said that power comes from the barrel of a gun. But it is not enough to have a gun or many guns. It is how you use the gun. So that, to me, is the key. And the key is that the communists use tactics which are very difficult to beat. In other words, they wage what I call unrestricted warfare. So they will, for instance, use barrier troops, the same way that Trotsky, of course, in recapturing Siberia in the early 1920s, used barrier troops. So barrier troops basically is you put soldiers behind the soldiers, so that the soldier has to move forward and might survive, whereas a soldier who turns around and flees is instantly shot. You use villagers as
basically human
barriers.
Shields.
As human shields, yes. You use villagers as human shields. You send villagers to absorb the bullets in human waves. There are telegraphs from Taiyuan.
Unbelievable.
Where Yan Xishan says, look, my soldiers are discouraged because they have to keep on shooting into unarmed soldiers, civilians. This disheartening is a horrible thing to do. But most of all, I think, to me, the key turning point is the siege of Changchun. We've all heard of Leningrad. We've heard of a great many cities. Changchun, not very often, although, of course, an estimated 160,000 civilians died of disease and hunger after Lin Biao blockaded the whole thing. So he gave the order in 1948 to quite literally turn Changchun into a city of death. Ba Changchun Biancheng Sicheng, turned it into a city of death. He does that for 8 months. It takes 8 months. This city, barely anyone survives. When it implodes, there's freezing cold, as you well know, so people use anything. They cut down trees, they take wood from buildings, they rip off asphalt from the streets just to stay warm. Then they start cannibalizing just about anything they can find, eat the bark from trees, leather belts. It is awful. It's just awful. But once Changchun falls, and other circles are being encircled, you have to ask yourself the question, what would you do if you were in charge of, say, Beijing? Fu Zuoyi is in charge of Beijing. Are you going to undergo the same fate? Are you going to watch Beijing being surrounded by communist troops? Are you going to watch that center of culture being completely destroyed from top to bottom? Of course, he surrenders. So there are still very large battles that take place, not least the Huaihai battle. 1 million troops confront each other and fight brutally. But ultimately, cities begin to fall like dominoes. High-level military commanders start to surrender. They no longer have the appetite to do. They can't fight an enemy that is determined at all cost to gain victory. There's a very interesting anecdote. So 49 is the end of the story, as you know. The government flees towards Taiwan. There's a very interesting document I read once in the Guoshiguan Taipei archives, and it dates, I think, from 51 or 52. And there's a high-level commander from the United States, and he speaks to Chiang Kai-shek. And he says, what the Chinese do in Korea during the Korean War, this is 52 or so, is just incredible. They use antique weapons, which was like 10, 20 years old, but they will just keep on sending troops towards you. And they're just impossible. It's impossible to fight. So Chiang Kai-shek looks at him and says, if you and the United Nations cannot fight the communists today, what do you think I should have done back in 1948 and 49? So that's the question. What can you do? What can you do?
I mean, it is quite remarkable that America committed this strategic own goal whereby they withdrew support to the KMT in the 40s and basically put the Communist Party in charge, only to fight them anyway, just a few years later. But this time for a tiny bit of this peninsula called Korea, when they could have had basically China. And I think even to this day, I don't see that much American reflection that really think properly through what happened.
Yes, they didn't want to fight them. They wanted them as partners, and in the end, they had to fight them in Korea at great loss and great cost,
and very little to show for. And so I think the story that you've told, that we've told, is really quite striking in that whereas the perceived wisdom of the ages is that the Communist revolution in China was the result of this agrarian movement that was really about peasants and not so much about workers, since China didn't have factories and industrialization, but centuries of history of peasants and dynastic cycles uniting under this communist banner who were taking care of the peasants, whereas the corrupt KMTs were exploiting the peasant through capitalism and imperialism. It is the communists who were really helping the peasants and eventually uniting them in the banner of nationalism, and there is some kind of historical will that determined the victory of the communist movement because they are on the right side of history. Whereas I think, Frank, your research is showing the key word there is violence and luck. That if you are violent enough at the right time, if you're patient enough, and then things could go your way. Is that a fair summary of the points that you're trying to make?
Yes, and also if you have the enormously influential backing of Moscow, and you have the unwitting help of Japan, both in 31, of course, which helped them establish the Soviet, and again in 37, the Japanese eliminated the very enemy or displaced the enemy that Mao could never confront. So great luck, but also great backing. I mean, without Moscow, had there not been a Comintern, had Lenin, Stalin decided to just not mind anyone else's business, there would never have been a communist party.
Well, and the Americans, some of the three most powerful forces in the world, the Russians, the Japanese, the Americans, all at some point came to Mao Zedong's aid.
Contributed. Yes, absolutely.
And before our podcast, I was reading the 第三次历史决议, the Communist document. I don't know what the English name is. The third interpretation of history, whatever, is the party's authoritative take on party history. And I'm reading how they're interpreting, when the October Revolution brought Marxism to China, the May 4th, and peasants and all that. No mention at all of the Soviets and the Americans and their role in the party's rise.
No, of course, but this is very common, isn't it? It's called biting the hand that feeds you. All these movements want to appear as being entirely locally, indigenously, and spontaneously generated, and it will be the same, of course, with North Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh, the communist Mao in particular. They just help. Even before 1949, helped the Vietnamese communists to a huge extent, only for the Vietnamese to turn against the PRC. Much like the PRC, of course, turns against the Soviet Union with the break in June 1960. So it's a very common pattern.
Of course.
But the reality is that without no Stalin, no Mao, I think is the summary.
I mean, even that playbook of trying to tell an indigenous story, that's a Stalinist playbook, not really a Chinese playbook.
I think so. The command from Moscow was very clear. We have abolished the Comintern. You are no longer part of it, and you should reinvent yourself as an indigenously generated movement responding to local conditions.
Yeah. And to wrap up your very generous sharing with us, what can we look forward to next? What do you have for us in cooking?
Well, I thought I should go back to, basically I want to write a history of China the last 2 centuries. So I want to bring the whole thing together. One thing I realized working on this book is the extent to which key events have been overlooked or neglected. And somehow this entire story has been twisted beyond recognition. So I really want to go back all the way to, let's say, 1800 roughly. I mean, 1644. Okay. The first thing to do is just, admit that the Qing is an empire and that they rule over the Chinese and that they play the same game that any other empire plays, that they're responsible for a massive genocide of the Zhonga, that they repress brutally throughout the 17th and 18th century. And during the 19th century, a lot of these repressed groups finally see a chance to fight back. And the result is an absolute bloodbath, costing tens of millions of lives. So that basically for me, dig around in the 19th century and then link it up with the 20th century into a sort of readable history of modern China. That's pretty much the goal.
The continuity of political violence in China.
Yeah, or just a history of modern China that doesn't sidestep the violence and the horror, or doesn't go into a mythology proposed by Beijing. That's an evidence-based history of modern China, I would call it.
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Frank, for sharing. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you liked what you heard, please do subscribe us wherever you listen to your podcast, and also follow us on Substack. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you next time.